Mr. Shannon.
We are now recording, and you may start.
You will be the spotlighter.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm starting with a very brief introduction because really the works of these two authors speak for themselves, and there will be time at the very end for your questions and answers. The questions go in the chat, and then Sheldon and I'm Sheila Lewis, he's Sheldon Lewis, and we've been married and doing this together for the first time this summer. So your questions in the chat should be concise and of interest to the general audience here. And we'll get to as many as we can after both of the authors have read and discussed their work. So you might find that your question has already been answered by the end. And just a note on the mute all, everybody because we have that power here. Sheldon, Martin, and I have that power. If there is something you want to say specifically to one of the authors or a question, you do have to know how to use the chat. And so just send it that way. The authors don't have to do that. We will screen and note the questions for them. So I just want to say we are extremely excited. I say this every week, but I'm really excited to introduce both authors tonight. We have first, we have Lynn Sharon Schwartz, and Sheldon is going to say a little more about her amazing career and all the books she's done. And what's interesting is we have your collection, Lynn, of stories, glimpses, and fables under the title of Truthtelling. And Marlena Maduro Baraf, pardon my not great Spanish accent, and her memoir, At the Narrow Waist of the World, which refers to growing up Jewish in Panama, a culture most of us don't know much about. Before I turn it over to Sheldon, again, just a reminder, if you're coming in, to stay on mute the whole time. If you do have a question, you can put it in the chat and we will get to it. That's because the ambiance, the background noise gets exaggeratedly loud on Zoom. And I think the titles and book covers are gorgeous, and they're not just on the brochure, on the flyer for no reason. They're there because if you click on them, you will be directed to being able to order these books. You can also find them at a local bookstore. We'll talk a little at the end how you can get them. We cannot do those transactions over this platform. And without further ado, Sheldon, take it away.
So first of all, we want to welcome everyone again. I don't know, Lynn, if you've seen the chat, but before I've even introduced you, we have people writing in the chat that Disturbances in the Field is their favorite book ever. So, so that's nice for an author who's about to read it. So Lynn Sharon Schwartz has been an extremely prolific author. You've written 27 books, I'm told. And they include the novels Disturbances in the Field, Leaving Brooklyn, and Rough Strife. Lynn has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the PEN Faulkner Award, and the PEN Hemingway First Novel Award. She's also written essays, short stories, memoirs, poetry criticism, and translations. My understanding is translations from Italian. I hope that's accurate. She is a widely respected writing teacher. She's taught in a lot of different venues, and she currently teaches at the Bennington College Writing Seminars. Lynn is also a co-founder of Calliope Author Readings, which produces recordings of great American authors reading from their works. Her most recent book, Truthtelling, Stories, Fables, and Glimpses, came out last year. And please join me in welcoming Lynn back to Scribblers.
Thank you. My turn.
Yes.
Okay, hello. I'm delighted to be here again, especially delighted that I keep being invited. I really love the Scribblers on the Roof. I love the roof, but we're not on the roof, but let's hope another year. It's wonderful out there under the stars. So let's make believe we are under the stars. So I'm going to read a story from Truthtelling. You know, people talk about the difference between stories and essays, and I'm not sure anymore that there is a lot of difference. I remember Dr. O said, you you know, there is no fiction or nonfiction, there's just narration. So I think of that this way. This, this is sort of true, but just want to turn on a light. But once, you know, once you take true events and you turn them into a story, they're not really true anymore because you shape them in your own way, and they're all different. But without further ado, as they say, I will read this. It's called But I Digress. ... I met a Russian at a party, a large, jovial man with a broad face, wearing a gray suit that looked heavily padded. Or maybe the man himself was padded. He had attractively messy fair hair, and in one beefy hand he held a drink. Not vodka, one of the amber ones. He was saying that nowadays Moscow or St. Petersburg were much more desirable places to live than New York. But since he had been here for 20 years and needed to attend to his thriving medical practice, what could he do? New York is ruined, he said. Too many people, all kinds of people. In the winter, he went to Florida, some beach or other, to hang out with fellow Russians in the same predicament, too successful to return. I suggested that if he wanted to see Russians near a beach, he had only to go to Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. He said, oh no, those are not really Russians. No, I said, they appeared to be Russian. They spoke Russian. They had colonized the neighborhood. All the signs were in Russian. The streets were lined with Russian restaurants and stores selling Russian food. When I walked along the boardwalk and saw the stocky people swaddled in their heavy coats against the wind coming off the ocean, the women with their hair dyed yellow or orange, like my mother's, sitting on benches, gossiping, the men striding along with their bellies leading and gesticulating with the hand that held their big glowing cigars like my father's. I was seeing my old aunts and uncles, my father's brothers and sisters, except my aunts and uncles had arrived decades earlier and so had learned to look and sound and dress like Americans. But they probably looked like that once. Now most of them were dead. The Russian shook his head. When I speak Russian to those people, he said, they don't really understand. They speak a different Russian. They're not really Russians. My father never spoke about his childhood in Russia, now Ukraine. I couldn't get a thing out of him. Not that I really tried. It was as if it had never happened, or it had happened but was not fit for the ears of children, like a visit to a brothel or something of which one is secretly ashamed. Once I referred to my father's background as Russian. He corrected me. Being Jewish and Russian in Russia, he said, is not being Russian. Then what is it, I wondered, but I didn't ask. Another time when I happened to mention the name of Vladimir Lenin in relation to some school assignment, he corrected my pronunciation, not Vladimir, but Vladimir. I was embarrassed and never made that mistake again. Not that Lenin's given name was one I had many occasions to utter. That was the only time my father indicated that he knew or had known Russian. My father's next older brother, George, had a different attitude. I once met him on the New York subway and was surprised to learn that he was on his way to a course in Russian at the new school in Greenwich Village. He wanted to, quote, brush up. I don't know if my mother knew much about my father's childhood, whether it was the kind of thing he talked about when they met and were courting. One thing she did tell me, he would never eat a banana because it was not something he had ever seen as a boy, perhaps an orange too. What an odd thing to avoid, an innocent, bland banana, as if it were something like escargot or fried locusts. Of course, the latter are not generally available in the New World. The only other clue that my father had had a Russian childhood was that he often quoted Lenin saying, religion is the opiate of the people. Though strictly speaking, a Russian childhood is not required for someone to quote those words. Now that I think of it, it wasn't Lenin who said that, but Karl Marx, a German Jew. Those people at Brighton Beach, I told the man at the party, they're Russian Jews. Everyone knew this. We could remember that they arrived in the 1970s when Russia relaxed its policies toward Jews and allowed them to leave. Some went to Israel and some came to Brighton Beach, where I had learned to swim as a child, now known as Little Odessa. I had a friend who ran an agency that found jobs for the many Russian doctors, lawyers, and so on, who could find work only as janitors or dishwashers. She would tell me their stories, immigrant stories, their expectations. They were disappointed. They had expected a welfare state, and now they had to fend for themselves. They came as doctors and became janitors. The Russian doctor I met at the party, I deduced, never went through the janitor phase. He was post-1989. My father didn't get very excited over the Jews coming because he had no relatives left to come. The older brother they had left there some 60 years before was no doubt dead with his family, possibly tossed in the ditch at Babi Yar. That's right, said the Russian doctor at the party, nodding. So I said, you mean they're not ethnic Russian? Is that what you mean? Yes, he said. Even though he had been in America for 20 years and boasted of his thriving medical practice, which was why he couldn't return to Moscow or St. Petersburg as he would have preferred, he hadn't yet learned that at a cocktail party in certain parts of New York City, one doesn't talk about people being or not being ethnically this or that. I didn't enlighten him. Let him keep it up. Let someone else call him on it one day. The Russian doctor at the party was awakening scenes with my father, especially his last weeks when he lay in a condition described as a stupor. Less than a coma, but more than a sleep. He had lain in this state for days, and I was impatient to have it over, to have him either wake up or die. He would hate to be seen lying there looking dead, with tubes emerging from under the blankets, carrying his bodily emissions and emptying them into large jars on the floor under the bed. After a few days of this, I asked the doctor if my father was in a coma, and if so, how long it could be expected to last. The doctor said, I'd call it a stupor. About how long it might last, he gave me a condescending look and said he couldn't answer those kinds of questions. I didn't mistake you for God, I replied. I just wanted your opinion as a doctor. One of my father's four older sisters, Frida, came to the hospital to visit him. She lived in Far Rockaway near the ocean. It was a long trip for her. The hospital was in Lower Manhattan. The subway was difficult. A cab was unlikely. Maybe someone gave her a ride. By some means, she appeared, or rather was heard first, clicking down the hall. She was a small, old, bony woman with fierce energy, whose features expressed a formidable will. She spoke with authority, as had all of my aunts and uncles. She was one of the few remaining. My father was the youngest of 9 children, their ages like steps, about a year and a half between each birth. Considering that most of them were in their teens or early 20s when they came to America from a town near Kiev, where they spoke Yiddish at home and Russian in school, their command of English was remarkable. I didn't mean simply that they were fluent. They spoke in gorgeously folded sentences, origami-like sentences, the way characters do in Victorian novels. My father, who was 11 or 12 when he arrived, spoke perfect, unaccented English. He acquired a large vocabulary and used many distinctive and rich words, not in common use by the native born. Manifest and belligerent were among his favorites. George, a year and a half older, the one who was studying Russian, had the barest trace of an accent, and so on up for the rest. They were a family talented at languages. Hearing them speak, following the arabesques of their sentences was a pleasure, regardless of the slight accent of the oldest ones, a pleasure maybe even enhanced by the accent. And Frida had very large teeth that seemed to share in the formation of her words. She had reddish brown hair pulled back in an upsweep, a word and style one doesn't see or hear much anymore. She was one of the middle children. Her speech was distinguished not so much by the accent as by a rare melodic lilt that might have come from the Middle East or one of the more remote regions of Asia. I noticed this Asian or Levantine quality also in my Aunt Anna and Uncle Dan, not in their speech, but in their appearance, the broad foreheads, the slightly slanted eyes, the sallow skin. I suspected that an ancestor had been raped or, to be optimistic, seduced by an invader from the East. Aunt Frida, who did not share that Eastern look, she had a narrowed face with hollowed cheeks, was a seamstress and had often made clothes for me when I was a child. I would stand in her tiny living room draped in something or other while she fussed over me with pins in her teeth. I was fond of her in her brusque, uncompromising nature. I saw something of a kindred spirit, but I was even more fond of her husband, Uncle Dave, very different temperamentally from my aunts and uncles by blood. Dave's accent was Eastern European mixed with British. On his escape from whatever doomed region he came from before coming to the United States, where he remained for a time on his escape from whatever doomed region he came from, he landed first in England, where he remained for a time before coming to the United States. The histories of all these aunts and uncles by blood or by marriage were notably vague, and now that they are all dead and likely to remain so, it was as if the past were not quite as real as the lives they began here, or were best cast off like shabby, no longer usable clothes. Uncle Dave was different from my father's family. He loved poetry and could wiggle his big ears. I delighted in his whimsical conversation. My father's family had no sense of whimsy. Delivered in a soft, gravelly voice and that partly British accent. In his stories, the line between fact and fiction was blurred, the way I liked it and still do. I was in my 20s when he died. Aunt Frida, knowing I was so fond of him, said I could come over and pick out a book from his library to keep. I chose Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. I had heard of it in college, but didn't imagine anyone still really read it, even less owned it. I was enchanted by the title. Frida took it off the shelf, but before she handed it to me, she leafed through it quickly. We sometimes keep money in books, she said. I too keep money in books, so I was entirely sympathetic to her checking the book. I still haven't read it, only leafed through it, but I do like having it on my shelf. It reminds me of Uncle Dave, and I like to imagine I might read it one day. I think I can count on remaining perplexed about my father and many other things. But who knows, perhaps the title is the best thing about it. I must remember that the charm of the word perplexed may be due to the translator rather than Maimonides himself. Whatever word Maimonides used in Hebrew or Greek, it was the translator who came up with perplexed. A lesser translator might have written confused or puzzled. I have on occasion kept money between its pages. Unlike Dave, my father was not a poetry lover, but he did go to high school and to law school. College in between was not required back then, and he often quoted a handful of lines that had evidently dug a permanent groove in his memory. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance on the desert air, from Thomas Gray's An Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which he used when referring to certain girl cousins already in their mid-20s and unmarried. Another favorite was Fools Rush In Where Angels Fear to Tread, from Pope's essay on criticism. This he had ample occasion to use since he considered most people fools, or at least not as intelligent as himself. I didn't know where these lines came from and simply accepted them as a sort of gospel. What a surprise to find them in the pages of my college textbooks. But about Aunt Frida's visit, memory is so prone to digression. To sustain a logical or chronological sequence, we must keep dragging our minds off their natural course, like a cowboy tugging on a calf with a rope around its neck who wants to run off into the fields. Still wearing her coat and hat, Frida leaned over my father's bed, her face inches from his, and with the thumb and forefinger of her right hand, she separated the upper and lower lids of his right eye. It was as if he were a piece of property she owned, furniture, or a newly completed garment she was checking for flaws. My stomach lurched at that terrible invasion of privacy. Even the eye burst out in protest. Don't do that. I suppose it was I who shouted those words, but it seemed at the time that I and my father's violated eye were one. To peer into what was behind a closed eyelid was not only invasive, but indecent, like lifting a sleeper's skirt to have a peek. Maybe Frida thought he had already become a thing, that is, a corpse. I would never normally yell at her. I was respectful to my aunts and uncles, but she didn't seem to care that I had yelled. She did let go of the eyelid, but not until she had ascertained that she couldn't wake him that way. She must have known he was alive. We would have told her if he had died, though he might have looked exactly the same the first few hours. No, she was simply trying to wake him from his stupor. A few weeks before my father went to the hospital that last time, Father's Day came along. I wanted to get him something, but couldn't think what he could use in his present state. I finally bought him a shirt. It was a beautiful shade of blue, somewhere between royal blue and navy blue, with a pattern like small polka dots, but not exactly dots, more like little plus signs, though that isn't exactly it either. I knew he would probably never be able to wear the shirt, but I didn't want to come, quote, empty-handed, a phrase I had often heard from my mother. So I brought the shirt. I felt foolish giving it to him, since it was so obvious he would never wear it, but he accepted it graciously, though not without a touch of irony, as if to say, ah, children, we have to humor them. He never did wear the shirt, and some months later, when my widowed mother was moving into my older sister's house, I came over to help her organize things for the move. My mother had never spent a night alone in any of the places she and my father had lived, and so it was inevitable that she would move in with my older sister and her husband, who lived nearby. Going through a closet, I came across the still brand new shirt and took it home. I hung it in my closet. I would have liked to wear it, but it was much too broad in the shoulders, so I told my husband he could wear it, which he did a number of times. I was glad the shirt was getting some use, but I could never look at it without thinking of my father and how indulgently he accepted the shirt. The last time I drove up to visit my father at home, shortly after the shirt episode, I found him lying fully dressed on the living room couch, which was upholstered in a white and gold pattern my mother had chosen. At that time, late in his life, my father was part owner of a furniture store, the source of the couch. He knew nothing about furniture. He was even colorblind. By training and inclination, he was an accountant and tax lawyer. I imagine the store was one of his last-ditch efforts to make a pile of money. The store was in Chinatown, and most of the customers were Chinese, so he and his partner hired a Chinese man for the day-to-day operations while they handled the accounting end. Both he and the partner had individual accounting practices, so they had little time to devote to the store. Eddie, the Chinese manager, was extremely gracious when members of the family came to the store, and from what we could tell, not knowing Chinese, he appeared to be gracious with the customers too. The store did well for a time, until my father discovered that Eddie had been siphoning off money for his personal use, which stunned us all since he was so charming. My father and his partner didn't press charges. Perhaps Eddie repaid the money, but they let him go and found someone less charming. Meanwhile, my mother, indeed everyone in the family, chose whatever furniture we wanted from the store. I didn't care for the heavy, ornate furniture and chose the simplest things I could find: a small red lamp and a round white kitchen table with 4 red chairs. My father seemed hurt, as if this was a judgment on his taste, even though he had no part in choosing the merchandise. Eddie did that. He lay on the white and gold covered couch, flat on his back. I bent over to kiss him. He accepted my kiss with tolerance and then turned his face to the wall. I remembered thinking that phrase because I had read it in a famous story by Ernest Hemingway. The character who knows his end is near, not through illness, but imminent murder, turns his face to the wall. Perhaps all those who know they will soon die by whatever means turn their faces to the wall. When I visited him in the hospital, I brought my embroidery. A few years earlier, when my daughter, then 4 years old, needed an eye operation, I acquired a small piece of embroidery made for cross stitching and brought it to do while I waited during the operation. I didn't think I could concentrate on reading. The embroidery had flowers and the alphabet and the design of a house. As a child, I had done these pieces of embroidery with my friends, patiently cross-stitching for hours, but never finishing anything. While my daughter was anesthetized and being cut, I did a small section of the embroidery, a few of the alphabet letters, using the same metal hoop I had used as a child. Hospitals were different back then. I slept overnight on a cot near my daughter's bed at night. Near my daughter's bed. But late at night, I sat in a small waiting room for patients who were sleeping over, and I smoked. It's unimaginable today that anyone would smoke in a hospital, but it was common then. I chatted with the other parents and nurses who came in to smoke as well. The operation was successful, and when we got home, I put the embroidery away. So each time my father went to the hospital during his final illness, I brought the embroidery and got a good way through it. Most of the alphabet and several flowers, but never finished it. I've used it for other operations in the family, and I still have it, not yet completed. My father did eventually wake up from what the doctor called his stupor. He didn't say much, but at least he was awake and could understand what we said to him. He had excellent nurses caring for him, kind and deft. A blonde Midwesterner, one from the Philippines, and the night nurse, Eva, a Polish immigrant. I tried to speak to him, just casual pleasantries, but he wouldn't respond. When they were out of earshot, he muttered, "You can't trust any of them." I was shocked because throughout his life, he had had many non-Jewish clients, as well as a few friends. He couldn't mean it, I thought. It was a feeling from his secret childhood, bubbling up to the surface, like part of a drowned body that sometimes surfaces in a river. My first urge was to object, but with him so uncomfortable and near death, it was no time for a lecture on brotherhood, so I let it pass. As things got worse, he began making an odd motion that I found baffling, perplexing, I should say. He put his thumb and first two fingers of his right hand together and made a turning motion. I thought he wanted to write something and offered him a pencil. I was used to seeing him with a yellow number 2 pencil in his right hand, which he used for his accounting, big ledger books with columns of figures that he added in his head, running the sharp point of the pencil down the columns. But he shook his head. He didn't want the pencil. He kept making the motion, and I never understood it. Only after his death did it strike me what he was doing. He was asking us to turn off the switch and let him die. The only trouble was he was not being kept alive by any switch, any artificial means, no ventilator or anything. His heart was very strong and simply wouldn't stop, regardless of his readiness. The heart did stop eventually. The day of his funeral was a sunny day in August and a lot of people attended. But that night came a heavy rain. All I could think of was that he was lying in the sodden earth. The earth of what was now his native land, because his first 12 years as a Jew in Russia were gone, practically speaking, except in his mind. It rained steadily and hard, and I had the almost uncontrollable desire to go to the cemetery and stand over his grave with an umbrella. I could finally ask him what it had been like in his childhood in Russia, a question I had never managed to ask. He would have disliked being asked and would not have answered. Maybe now, dead and sodden, he would have no reason to immerse those years in silence. He might have grown indifferent, or if not indifferent, accepting.
Thank you so much. That was just stunning. We're mesmerized, and I can't wait. I know will be lots of questions and comments for you, Lynn. Thank you for sharing that amazing story and glimpse. And we will now, before we get to the questions, we will now turn to our second author, Marlena Maduro Baraf, and her first memoir, before we get into that, At the Narrow Waist of the World, just a word about Marlena. She has written many articles and literary articles. She's written for different journals, Lilith, you must know that, Lumina, Sweet Literary, Huffington Post, and has worked in the design and editorial and writing fields. She now lives in New York with her husband. And she spent her, as you'll hear from excerpts from her memoir, she spent her childhood in a country that most of us know very little about. It's just very poetic and interesting and informative, and I don't want to take up too much time telling you how great it is, but do welcome Marlena, At the Narrow Waist of the World.
I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone, and Sheldon and Sheila, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with Scribblers. My book, At the Narrow Waist of the World, I think it's backwards like that, it's about that primary relationship, mother, that first love affair, mother longing. But it's also populated by Jewish tios, tias, grandmother, cousins, which is true of any good Latin American story. Other themes are mental illness and otherness. I'm going to read the very first scene I wrote, which later became the start of the memoir. It's called Mami. And another tiny scene after that. Mami. I can almost touch the memory of my mother on that day in the patio under the calabash tree. I must have been in the kitchen when I heard dear Walter's voice just outside. I stepped out. Mami's body is dense and still like wax. Her eyes don't see me. Mami's beautiful bearing has sunk into itself. I cannot tell if she's listening to my uncle. I don't remember anything I may have said. I was 7. We can see so much when we're 7. We can see everything. Our ears almost hurt. The cells expand to near bursting to reach a point of understanding. I heard my tio whisper into the phone that morning, shock therapy, the sugar kind, he said. She almost died. Julita almost died. Mami's tongue was strange for weeks. She would stick it out huge and fleshy and pull it back into her mouth. No one said what was wrong. We watched. Patricia and I waited. For me and Patricia and our baby brother Carlitos, Mami was ours, inescapably our mama. She was a piece of us like a nose or budding breast. When she pressed the fleshy part of her thumb against her teeth, again and again, we were her thumb. Stop, Mami. I bit and tore with my teeth any white that I spied at the edge of my nails. Patricia chewed her nails to the quick. We pushed our stumpy fingers into the folds of our skirts. When Mami came to our school, she begged the nuns to pray for her. We were not Catholic, but she sought help from anyone who might have special access. Mami developed any illness that struck a friend or a relative. She relished feeling the pain and demanding the medication. Fix yourselves up, están gordas. You're fat, she would insist. Why doesn't anyone like you? The torrent of accusations pushed my sister out of the house. I was Sunny, capable of playing the game. Mami was sick. Yo lo sabía. I knew it. Me odian, me quieren matar. Mami told anyone who would listen they want to kill me. When she took to her bed in a self-induced illness, I became the emissary between her and the evil maids. I had the job of bringing meals to her on the white tray with hinged sides, the hot milk in the noritake cup, and the English silver setting. I place the tray down on the bed and she begins recitation. They want to poison me. They've poisoned the food. Mommy is not poisoned, I tell her. I promise. Te juro, te lo juro. I saw the preparation with my own eyes. The moment arrives. Entonces, pruébalo. Then taste it. Good little girl that I am, I taste the bitter truth. I grind a piece of lomito with my teeth and I collect some grains of rice in the cup of my tongue. I'm going to read another tiny piece. And this one I've called Skin. So I push a new wave of yellow skin with my thumbs when I give mommy her massage. I pull in my breath and send strength to my fingers that catch on the silky straps of her gown. The skin mingles with the drooping gown. Mommy is lying face down on the big bed, almost naked. Her face is turned to the louvered window, and her right arm is twisted backwards. The red fingernails scrape little arcs on my knee. Today, mommy is a witch. If I don't think or breathe, I will disappear. Her flesh is clammy. It's always clammy. There are specks of black on the top of her shoulders. My freckles, she remembers, as I press on them to send the muscle down. Her mouth is loose. In a few moments, she will let out a snore that will startle me. Shall I leave? Instead, I stare at the vials of yellow pills on the night table. I check the flesh on my own chewed fingers. I can give un masaje delicioso, mommy says. I know it's true. I also know that I'm not mommy. Why do I know this? Because I'm not nervous, because I work at lining up my thoughts. Mommy talks about her body all the time, her mushy lungs and cancer, or a lump on her teta, or the muscle of her pumping heart, or her ear-shaped kidneys, or her scary tongue, and the painted skin is mommy's body against me. So this was the first scene, not intending to write a memoir. But after that, I couldn't stop. Mommy became the model of other scenes and how I developed this memoir. Sensory, immediate, from a place that was still alive with me after so many years. Mosaic pieces that painted a story. Almost as I'm sure Lynn well knows, almost or all writing is an act of discovery, especially memoirs. There is something unfinished that pulls you. My mother had a chronic anxiety that sometimes she could function rather well, but sometimes she could not, and she was interned or taken to private psychiatric facilities in the United States during my childhood. She was for months and years, so there was a level of absence as well in my childhood story. I left Panama in my teens for boarding school and decided to stay eventually in the United States. I didn't understand it at the time, but I was pushing away from her. and I landed in another country. So the book became a path to finding her again. Mary Carr, everyone I'm sure has heard about her. She's considered the godmother of memoir with the Liars Club, that was published in 1985, said, "Memory haunts and casts its magic. After childhood, it's all hearsay." So I wasn't only excavating the past or understanding my mother, which was driving the story, but for the pure pleasure of reliving the past. Writing this memoir was a way to reclaim my home that I had left 50 years before, or a little bit less. My identity and access to my memories came, in most cases, in Spanish. I'm going to read a couple little, pluck a couple little sentences from my prologue. When I began to write this story, I found that it became impossible to strip it of my language of birth. Spanish expressions came loaded with meanings dragging behind, cans tied to the back of cars of newlywed couples, strings of story and culture. Tone of voice, a phrase, a snapshot in my mind. This is how my memories began. Fragments remembered and raw feelings leading me to a predestined accounting. My mother, Mommy, had an undiagnosed mental illness. She was taken to psychiatric hospitals when I was a girl and young woman. Here is a story of loving her and holding her at a distance, a self-protective reflex that set me on a Panama, United States journey and changed the center of my world. Están gordas, she told us, not you are fat. Gordas is fuller, richer in meaning, linked to Colombian artist Botero's corpulent figures more than to the derisive and simplified fat. And a teta is not a breast, not even a tit. I'm plucking little things here. The words chose me, the ones that expressed a fuller meaning or played a better tune with English, the flexible language of my more recent acquaintance. The sound, the mix of Spanish and English to my ear, because it's so much part of my life, is a beautiful thing. It's almost another language. I didn't use it that much in this book, but when I talk to my brothers or sister, or any of my cousins in Panama, they're all still there. We mix the languages, and I'm very interested in, for instance, Spanglish poetry. It's an entirely new language. So you see the timing. Another important protagonist in my story is family and Panama. We were a clan, Spanish, Portuguese, Jews of the Sephardic Jews of the diaspora. Not so different from other Latin American families. Julia Alvarez says for Latin American families that family is the soil, and it very much is. I think immigrant families in this country were that way. But they were my family is still very close-knit. Family for me was normality. If a mother couldn't function or a father died very young, they were role models. There was a particular aunt who was my mother's cousin, and she became the model of what a perfect mother would be. And she loved this as well. I also picked men to be daddies. So they were a safety net. They're very much a part of this story. So just to tell you, because this is a Jewish community, at least the temple is, a little more about the family that's a part of the story. They went from Spain, they left Spain to Portugal during the Spanish Inquisition. When the Inquisition started in Portugal, they then went back to Spain for perhaps one generation. I think they could be in Spain at that point. Then to Amsterdam for about 4 generations, and then to the Caribbean. And Curacao, for example, and St. Thomas. The first relatives that came to Panama, my relatives that came to Panama, were found in the 1850s. They formed their congregation, a Burial and Benevolent Society, in 1876. So that's the founding of the congregation, but they didn't have a temple until the 1930s. Most schools in the time that I was in Panama were run by religious orders. And I went to a Catholic school. It's different now. There are many more schools. There are even some Jewish schools, never exclusively Jewish. Panama, it's a lot of different people, and it's a little bit like New York in that sense, and pretty accepting of difference. So I'm going to read to you a little piece about the school and some of those experiences. This is really a coming of age story, as you maybe have figured out. This is called Judía. Panama, 95% Catholic, had been a crossroads for trade for hundreds of years. And Panameños were accustomed to people of many sorts. But if someone asked, ¿Eres judía? You pulled in a short breath and gulped it down. The word for Jew in Spanish is harsh, the letter J sounding like an H in English, thrown from the throat across the upper palate. Hebrea was a better, softer word, H in Spanish having no sound. Los Hebreos were the people of the book, children of Abraham and Moses, receivers of the commandments. Tú mataste a Jesús. I was sitting in the back of the bus with no way to escape. I still remember the burning words. 8-year-old Camila had twisted her head to face me. You killed Jesus. Small flames circled my spongy heart. The school bus fell silent. We knew the damning fact. We had learned it in La Clase de Religión. Judas, the traitor, turned in the Son of God. Judas, the betrayer, un judío. The nuns at school were respectful. We, the Spanish Jews, were an established community older than the country, almost rabiblancos, the white-tailed elite of Panama. Nevertheless, I studied Catecismo and Religión and learned about purgatory, where souls with venial sins could take up temporary residence. Madre, can Jews go to purgatory, I asked? Not unless they convert. But if you're good and you die before you convert, what happens? ¿Vas al infierno? Sí, replied my teacher. The rule is that if you have heard of Jesus and don't convert, you cannot be saved. What about limbo? Can Jews go to limbo? If there was a baby not Catholic who died before he had ever heard the name of Jesus, he can go to limbo. Where did I belong? How could these madres who knew my family believe that we would skid down in a giant chute to burn forever with the devil? Patricia and I succumbed. We snuck pink rosary beads into the house and said prayers at night under our bed sheets. When Patricia worried about a boy, she prayed to the Virgin Mary. I want to convert. I confess to Madre Concepcion, I want to be a nun like you. The madres held me back for a while, then arranged a meeting with a priest in the front room where they welcomed parents. I poured out my anguish. Padre, me quiero convertir. Me quiero convertir. Niña, he said, espere un poco. Wait until you're older. You have a fine tradition in your judaísmo. ¿Sabes? In this little piece, a mama is my grandmother. That's what we called her. Because I didn't grow up in her time, I never understood the disquiet. At the end of a school day, when I might come to visit, my doting mama would look up at me with her troubled, blue, questioning eyes. ¿Con quién andas? Who are your friends? She never spelled it out, but I knew that I was meant to unearth an Arias, a Vallarino, or another prominent name in Catholic society. I resisted revealing the names of my friends that did match what my mama longed for. My friends were my friends, Anita, Marce, Ceci, mis amigas católicas, who lived not too far from mi casa de piedra on Calle Uruguay. Were mama's worries miedos de un pasado antiguo? Were they fears of banishment from Spain that coursed in the family blood? Why was my abuelita so bothered? So these, in spite of, living in a Catholic society for so many years, my family was able to hold on to their Jewishness and have been holding on to it for 600 years and before in Spain. They were part of the fabric of Panama there since before Panama became a nation. So they were there when the French began building their canal, which was not completed, in the movement for independence during the building of the Panama Canal. An example of how integrated they were in the tiny society, right? Remember that. A great uncle was a founder of the fire brigade. Another great uncle founded the National Symphony in Panama. They retained their identity as Jews, but they did not segregate themselves. They felt safe in Panamanian society because it has up to now accommodated so many different people, and hopefully it will remain that way. So I just want to tell you one anecdote, last anecdote. In 2016, I traveled to Panama. I flew to Panama. I go about every year and a half, of course, not during this COVID time. My entire family is still there. It was the 140th anniversary of our congregation, that 1876 date. And they had a celebration at the temple, at the synagogue, a service. There was a Greek Orthodox priest, the Archbishop of Panama, several other Catholic priests, the ambassador for Israel, Protestant ministers of all kinds, the rabbis of our conservative and Orthodox synagogue, and the then another dignitaries in Panama, and then President Varela, Panama President Varela, was up on the dais, and he read some prayers. He had chosen some prayers to read, Jewish prayers, and held a Torah at some point in the dais. And when the congregation, the rabbi leading, walked the Torah around the floor, the president of Panama was holding the Torah behind the rabbi as an honor. That's it for me. And I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So we're gonna move on to our questions and answers for both authors. Thank you, Marty. And if we can bring Lynn in as well.
We have lots of good questions.
There you are. So, and Lynn, I'm going to invite you to unmute as well. So we have a number of questions around this theme of the blurring of fiction and nonfiction. I have to admit, Lynn, when I read your book, that there were times when I wasn't sure what I was reading. You know, like the page turner. I didn't know if it was a description of an actual person or if it was a short story. And we have a question from Laura Esther Wolfson about, would you perhaps have reclassified some of the work that was classified one way or another by your publisher? And I'm also wondering, like, is there a choice involved at a certain point that this is going to be something you're writing as an essay or something that you're going to fictionalize?
Well, do you want me to go first? Okay, I'll answer that. I'll try to answer that. Well, it's something like the page turner. I mean, to tell you the truth, which I don't like to do when it comes to fiction, but the page turner is true. I went to a concert and I observed a young woman, and that's what I observed. But of course, I made up, you know, she didn't really have all these qualities. She was very beautiful and so on. But I imagined, you know, all the stuff that I wrote about what she could mean. Well, that's why I don't like to have these strict borders, because I would say it was true that I went to this concert. I saw this beautiful woman, young woman, and she looked the way I described her. But I attributed in my imagination, I attributed all sorts of qualities to her, which could not possibly be. So I don't like to define it. At first, actually, most of the stories in Truthtelling are quite new. I wrote them the last 3 or 4 years. But there are a couple of old ones, and that the page turner appeared much earlier in a book of essays. But when I was compiling Truthtelling, I thought, well, why not put that in? Because it fit in with the others. It was kind of a, you know, like an imaginative construct. There are a lot of stories in there that, you know, they're surreal or they couldn't happen. They veer off into the other world. So that's about the page turner. Then the But I Digress, which I read, that's true too. But I mean, that stuff really happened. And that also appeared as an essay in a magazine online called Narrative. But when I read it over, I thought this is a story. I mean, you now you see me and you know me, so it maybe matters to you. But most of the people who read the book will never see me or know me, but so they can read it as a story. It can be true or not true. And you know, I shaped it. I did so much shaping with it that it's not the way. I don't remember the consecutive. You know, whether I met the man at the party, which was real, when my father was sick or later, I don't remember. So it's shaped like a story. So there is such a thing as in between or narrative. Well, we don't have to give it a name. Does it matter?
I agree 100%. And I love what you say, Lynn, that when you start shaping it, you really have created something new. And you might want to call it fiction. And you know, and I created a container for my story and for the little stories.
Yes.
And if I were to write a similar scene or situation, it might be completely different, depending on where I am at the time and what my head wants to do with it. So I don't think it matters. And a lot of nonfiction and memoir in particular is written like fiction. So I think the boundaries are very blurred. As they should be.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. I'm just always amazed. I love what you're both saying, because what it's coming down to is a good story is a good story, and also our memories. How do we really know what happened when we're 12 years old? But the authenticity in both are so strong. I had a question we have, again, lots of questions. We want to get to them all. A question for Marlena. because I was fascinated with the mosaicness, actually both your work, the mosaicness of how you, although it was largely about the relationship with the mother, there was so much other interesting stuff. What was the process like for you, gathering all this material and then shaping it into, I love Lynn's description of shaping. And then all of a sudden there's this book that is somewhat a mosaic, somewhat a memoir, and maybe other things. What was that process like for you?
Well, it was not difficult to, of course, it's always difficult to write, but to write the scenes, that has its own difficulty and excitement, and it's the wonderful part of writing, you know, it's the actual writing. But in terms of putting it into a book, it's a little, you know, you need to connect them. There needs to be a through line. For me, the through line was not a through line I invented, is that as I started writing, I needed to find out what my mother had been like. And had she loved me, I think it seems such an ordinary thing to say, but I think beneath it all, that was a biggie. And what did I miss? So that's the thread, you know, the confrontation with mother. But there was a lot of history. There were the, you know, Panama, who knows about Panama? Who knows about this Jewish community? It wasn't only the Jewish community, it were my friends, and, you know, they weren't all Jewish, but who knows about this community was part of this, quite part of the story, because of that cohesiveness. So how to tell the story, and it was hard. I had to push myself to write more because I kept editing down and editing down. And there might be one of my writing colleagues in this presentation here, and so I just had to push to write and try to keep the mommy thread in there and bring it in when I wouldn't, you know, she was absent. So I had to keep the thread of the mother. And I think in the end I did link it, and then weave history, and you have to do that very delicately so as not to destroy the rest. So that's how I did it.
Thank you. I was wondering, Lynn, because you've written a lot of short fiction as well as larger works like novels. I know as a journalist, I often found that it was harder to write something short than to write something long. So I'd be interested in your experience of the difference between writing short fiction and writing a big work like a novel.
Well, a novel is hard because it's long. You know, it takes a long time to get all those words together. So but actually the story is, I have a wonderful essay about the difference between them. It uses lots of images. This short story, he says, I can't remember the critic's name, is, you know, out at 6, back at midnight. Or the short story is like a fuse, you know, slowly going toward the place where it catches. A short story, you really should have nothing excess in a short story. You have to make sure everything that's in there belongs in there. And we saw, and Marlena's, I know they're not stories, but what you did was like that, in short pieces, that everything, you couldn't take a sentence out without destroying the whole fabric. So a short story should be like that. Whereas a novel, you have a little more leeway, you know, if you want to go into more detail or describe something, or sort of indulge yourself a little more. Of course, everything has to be necessary, but a short story is really more like I wish I could compare it to, you know, a perfect little poem. And a novel is a big, what was it? Somebody, I think it was Conrad, who said, you know, a loose baggy thing, or a long work of prose that has something wrong with it. The novel is, I mean, I find the novel harder just because it takes so long. It could take 2, 3 or more years. But a story, you know, I have students who they're supposed to come up with something every month, and I don't know how they do it. I could not do that. it takes me several months to complete a story. You have to be so careful.
Mm. We have a Spanish question for Marlena from one of our resident Spanish scholars. And the question was, did your family speak Ladino, or did they speak Spanish exclusively?
No, I do believe they did not speak Ladino. I think the Ladino was not spoken by the people who went to Amsterdam and in England, also my family, some of my family, and then into the Caribbean. I've always, wondered about that, but we don't, nobody, absolutely nobody. I'm sad to say. We lost the sound.
Oh, no,
Yeah, we're
no.
here, sorry.
I think we have several really interesting comments, which I can't see on my screen, but Sheldon can.
Here's one.
Here we go. I'm just going to read some of them. And this is from Beth out in the Midwest. Kids are fascinated with the alignment of language used in both of your work and the stories. And Lynn, one line in your story struck this person who wrote, when you describe the character's language, arabesque of language, how did you come up with that phrase? So that phrase stuck with this person who is also a writer and a poet. The arabesque.
It was a kind of a gift. Sometimes things just come to you.
Arabesques, mosaics, you really have covered it, both of you.
Thank you.
Was there one more question from the pile? There were so many good questions.
There's so many questions. Somebody asked, Lynn, you've written so much, like, how do you actually do it?
Yeah, that was a really good question.
Well, I didn't hear
That's
that.
one of my,
If the pandemic was good or bad for you guys as writers, maybe it was good.
How do you actually write so much was one of the questions.
It was bad. I don't
Bad.
I don't know how I wrote so much because I didn't have a regular full-time faculty teaching job, which a lot of people did, to make a living, and I did other things. And I think when you become an academic, which is a fine thing to be, but it wouldn't be for me if I wanted to be a writer, you get very involved in the world of academia, and I think that's one thing that made me able to write in my spare time. Or I got lots of little gigs here and there, and I would travel, a month here, a month there, but I could write. I never got involved in university politics. And then I work hard and I don't watch television.
Oh, that's the secret.
I have a question for Lynn, if I may.
Please.
I read your book, as I mentioned to you, Truthtelling, and for everybody here, it's absolutely divine. It's gorgeous stories. I can identify with every character, with every story, with the characters in every story. So I want to know, among many things, what is the spark that gets you going on a story? What are some of the kinds of sparks that get you going? How does it happen?
Well, they're
particular
different.
Story.
They're different in every story. Well, all right, I'm looking. Well, all of you haven't read it, but I have a story called "I Want My Car," in which it's sort of a funny story. A couple has broken up, and the wife borrows the car, and she just won't give it back. A friend told me that story, I would say, maybe 40 years ago. It happened to somebody who knew. And I tried to write it. I couldn't. And then I decided you can't write from something somebody told you. It has to come from yourself. But somehow, just last year, I was able to write this. And I don't know what it was. It finally ripened in me. Or there's some, let's see, I'm trying to look at the others. Oh, The Return of the Frenchman, where a woman sees the man she met at a dinner party. Well, that was true. I once met a man at a dinner party, and it was just nothing serious. I mean, I just have fantasies about him. There's nothing. There's nothing. but I enlarged it. I made it into a big deal. And that's one way I make things into a big deal. You know, fiction is also exaggeration. And then there was one that they come in all different ways. My editor, there's one called Career Choice. It's the longest one. A young woman marries an Italian, much older man. He knows that the editor knew that I did translations into Italian. He said, why don't you do something with an Italian theme? You know, put it in. I said, all right. So I decided to, I would do that. And what would I would have her I'd have the character take a class in Italian. And then as I was writing, it turned into something entirely different. I don't know how it happened. It became a love story, really. And the man was Italian. There were a few little phrases in there, but it became something quite other. And also meditation on, you know, older men marrying much younger women. And, you know, that happens a lot, or chasing them. And what is that all about? And so they're all, I write little things down, you know, sometimes I get an idea. And sometimes I look at these notebooks and I find like maybe I wrote 10 things and 2 of them became a story and the rest just sat there in the notebook. Well, it's the same with you. How do you have so many incidents, say with your mother, how did you know which ones to use?
Yeah, how does this start? I wrote it some years back, and I don't remember the triggers, but it was definitely an emotional feeling. What took me to each of the scenes there was an emotion. And I have some with my father at the autocine, at the drive-in, and seeing the screen and the cowboys, gigantic in Panama. And so it's like a feeling and a visual for you, for me.
So I could listen to you guys for hours, but the Zoom gods might cut us off. So I have the challenge of bringing this wonderful evening to a close. And I'm just, Sheldon and I and everybody on Zoom, we're just so grateful. You've both given us so much to think about and to read. Just a plug again, please go online and find a way to order these books, or go to your bookstore. You can ask for them. I do know our local Barnes & Noble and Book Culture probably does have Lynn Sharon Schwartz's book. Marlena's, we might have to search a little further, but you can click on the flyer. So that's one. And the other is, I just want to thank all your guests for being here and these amazing questions and helping this dialogue to come alive. And finally, next week, we will hear from one of our own members, Anshe Chesed's poet, Owen Lewis, and his book, Field Lights. So poetry lovers, do come for that, along with another Anshe Chesed connector, Roger Bennett, who wrote a book that was very well received, Reborn in the USA. Some people have had extended launches due to COVID and the pandemic, but we get to, you know, get the fruits of all that this summer with such amazing authors. So same time next week, and looking forward to seeing all of you back, and looking forward to all of you reading Lynn and Marlena's books soon as you can. So thank you, all of you.